A History of Epidemics in the Near and Middle East, Episode 4, a podcast organized by the IFPO, exceptionally today with Valentina Vezzoli, researcher at the Department of Arabic, Medieval and Modern Studies. Have epidemics changed the history of the Near and Middle East? How did societies from this region react to this phenomenon? Our podcast wants to look back at the history of epidemics in a region which has been regularly affected during the past. We will rely on the work of historians, archaeologists, linguists, and philosophers who have agreed to answer our questions. Guest for today is Lara Meneghini from Italy. She has a PhD in Islamic archaeology and she is specialized in building archaeology of Iran. Since 2002, she has been collaborating as a volunteer archaeologist for the Archaeoclub of Venice, which, along with ECOS Club, has been working for more than 30 years on the project The Rebirth of an Island, which aims to recover, restore and enhance the island of Lazzaretto Nuovo, located in the northeastern lagoon of Venice, a site of important historical, archaeological and environmental value. From 2013, the Archaeoclub of Venice, thanks to an agreement, is also in charge to welcome the public on the island of Lazzaretto Vecchio in the southern lagoon. Lara will discuss with us today about how the city of Venice, leader of the Mediterranean trade during the Middle Ages and early modern history, reacted to the threat of the plague in order to guarantee its economic interest in the region. We will discuss with her more in particular about the creation of the lazzarettos and their role in preventing the spread of epidemics. First of all, welcome Lara and thank you for being with us today. We are discussing with you today about how the city of Venice has reacted to the epidemics that hit the Mediterranean during the Middle Ages and early modern history. The history of Venice is marked by intense political, cultural and economic relations with the Mediterranean wall, and in particular with the Eastern Mediterranean. The Republic of Venice, known as the Serenissima, was, during the Middle Ages and early modern history, one of the leading authorities of the sea trade, being present in all the main harbors of the region: Alexandria, Beirut, Acre, Istanbul. Venice was at that time a huge market, not only trading but also producing the most variegated items, which it exported all over Europe: glasses, furniture, precious textile, jewels, ceramics, and of course, spices. Before the plague of 1576, Venice counted around 168,000 inhabitants. Venice was also the main harbor for pilgrims who wanted to reach the Holy Land. So its commercial interests in the region were considerable. In order to maintain this supremacy, Venice developed profitable diplomatic and political relationships with the main power of the region. From the second half of the 13th century until the beginning of the 16th century, the city was the main commercial partner of the Mamluk Sultanate. Mamluk Egypt and Syria at that time constitute the richest market of the Mediterranean area, where spices, drugs, textile and ceramics were collected from all the Near East and from Central Asia or China and then were traded towards European harbors. From the beginning of the 13th century, the Venetian owned a fondaco and consuls and vice-consuls in the main commercial city of Syria and Egypt: Alexandria, Beirut, Acre, Tripoli, Damascus. The fondaco was a space for collecting goods, but also for hosting Venetian merchants. After the rise of the Ottoman Empire, Venice continued to maintain an important role in the region, but the competition with the Ottomans in controlling this trade was tough, and there were moments of strong conflict between the two powers. We shall not forget that Venice territories were not limited to northeastern Italy. The city controlled most of the eastern coastal area of the Adriatic and Aegean Sea, such as Dalmatia, Peloponnese, Crete, and from the 15th century also the island of Cyprus. For the city of Venice, protecting its economic interests in this region also meant trying to prevent epidemics from spreading in these territories in order to avoid blocking its vital source of income, trade. So, Lara, given the important economic interest in the Mediterranean region, Venice was the first to develop a system in order to contain and control epidemics, and more specifically to contain the plague, which was the most feared contagious disease at that time. How did this system work?
First of all, I would like to greet everyone and thank you for inviting me to talk about the Venetian lazzarettos. Well, let's start by telling how the lazzarettos were born. Following the plague epidemic waves that had hit Europe in the second half of the 13th century, in 1423, a resolution of the Venetian Senate establishes the institution of a hospital intended for the treatment and isolation of plague patients. Among the various proposals, they chose the island of Santa Maria di Nazareth, which is located in the southern lagoon near the Lido of Venice, and which over the centuries had been inhabited by the order of hermits of St. Augustine, who built a church, which initially gave its name to the place, and who, in addition to the convent, built a hospice to accommodate pilgrims returning from the Holy Land. The management of the hospital was controlled by the state of Venice, not by the religious order, and was financed with the earnings from the salt trade. The term lazzaretto probably originates from a corruption of the name Nazareth, from which Nazaretto, that later became Lazzaretto, perhaps due to an overlap with Lazarus. The structures present on the island were adapted for the new function. Towards the end of the 15th century, an inventory reports the presence of about 209 beds. So the hospital was run by a prior and managed by one or two doctors and some helpers. It was a great innovation, not only because the management was state-run, but also because it became a permanent stronghold, which had also prevention purposes. A few decades later, the Senate promoted the construction of a new hospital, exclusively with preventive tasks, designed to house those who recovered from plague and were to spend a period of recovery, and those who came from places where epidemics were taking place, or people who traveled on ships on which plague cases had occurred. Therefore, in 1468, the construction of a second hospital started, this time in the northern lagoon, on an island called Vigna Murada, which means walled vineyard. This lazzaretto was named Lazzaretto Nuovo, so the new lazzaretto, to distinguish it from the already active hospital, which from that moment was called Lazzaretto Vecchio, the old lazzaretto. The word quarantine, so often used in the last few months due to the COVID-19 pandemic, comes from the Venetian word quarantena, which means 40 days, and was used to indicate the isolation period to be spent on the Lazzaretto Nuovo. If during the quarantine the doctor in charge of visiting the guests found a full-blown case of plague, the patient had to be transferred to the hospital on the Lazzaretto Vecchio.
We have said that Venice was the main leader of Eastern Mediterranean trade and that it extended its power to some of the coastal territories of the Adriatic and Aegean Sea, Dalmatia, Greece, Crete, Cyprus. Being conscious that all this system has to be protected, the Republic of Venice created a net of lazzarettos in the Mediterranean. How did this network work?
The Republic of Venice had the intuition and the strength to build a prevention system, or at least to put a cordon sanitaire into operation to try to limit epidemics. The verification and management standards implemented and the hygiene rules were promoted and disclosed also outside the city. For the Venetian state, safeguarding public health also meant safeguarding trade, which, we should not forget, was the primary source of wealth for the city. The system was in fact extended to other territories dominated by Venice, the Dalmatian coast, Greece, and the mainland domains as well. Based on the Venetian model, soon many harbors in Italy, France, and Spain established their own lazzaretto. However, it's necessary to mention the city of Dubrovnik, which, since the epidemic of 1348, had implemented systems for disinfection of goods, laying the foundation for preventive isolation. The Mediterranean lazzarettos therefore began to function as a control network capable of identifying and reporting any plague outbreak.
How has Venice been rewarded for this meticulous work of prevention and control?
Venice understood that the only remedy to contain plague was prevention, and the Venetian state decided to isolate the sick and quarantine all those who came from areas at risk or who had been in contact with the sick. Furthermore, they regulated disinfection procedures of the goods, which were held in isolation as well, and subjected to treatments such as fumigation or washing with salt water or water and vinegar. The hygiene rules also concerned the city, and commercial contacts with areas where epidemics were taking place were usually suspended. The measures, though not conclusive, were certainly effective. In fact, in Venice, the last recorded epidemic is that of 1630. Therefore, despite the maritime traffic, the city freed itself from plague more than a century earlier than other Mediterranean harbors.
Let's now talk about material evidence. Given your experience in the archaeology of the lagoon, tell us about what is left of this prevention and control structure. What type of data emerge from the archaeological source?
Both the lazzarettos have been investigated archaeologically. The Lazzaretto Vecchio still preserves many standing buildings and has been investigated in conjunction with the restoration work carried out between 2004 and 2008. During the excavations, large areas used as mass graves were brought to light, evidence of the great epidemics that hit the city. The Lazzaretto Nuovo, instead, has less standing buildings and has been investigated extensively since 1988. The change of function during the 19th and 20th century has caused the demolition of many structures and the reconstruction of the surrounding wall. The archaeological excavations have allowed to investigate the area of the infirmary, the church, some of the lodgings for the quarantine people, the palace of the prior, and the bakery ovens. The archaeological source so far confirms what we know from a 17th century plan. That is, the island was divided in several isolation areas in order to keep separated both people and goods that had arrived at different times. The excavations, however, also allowed us to identify in the southeast area evidence of medieval structures probably related to a former occupation level. In anthropological investigations has also been underway for some years now in the cemetery area, and again these are mass graves. Then the archaeological finds, ceramics, coins, and personal objects highlight the presence of not only Venetian materials but also materials from other relevant Mediterranean areas.
We have been talking at the beginning about the economic, political, and cultural connection between Venice and the Near East. What can you say about the archaeological evidence related to the passage of ships and travelers from that region?
Venice was at the time a commercial center that served as a contact point between Northern Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. So, Venetian ships were mainly active in the main harbors of the Near East and Alexandria in Egypt. Evidence of these trades are well evidenced in both the lazzarettos. First of all, let's mention the wall writings of the Lazzaretto Nuovo inside the Teson Grande, which was the main warehouse where are mentioned ships that arrived from Constantinople, Alexandria, and Cyprus. During the archaeological excavations, numerous Ottoman or Oriental style pipes were found, as well as fragments of Ottoman ceramics, especially from Kütahya, Esnek, and Çanakkale. Among these, two assembled fragments, probably a coffee cup, with an epigraphic inscription Ottoman Turkish, is currently exhibited in the Museum of the Island. During some excavations, also small fragments of Middle Eastern fruitware were found, and these are dated back to the medieval time. As for the Lazzaretto Vecchio, however, I would like to mention that among the epigraphic inscriptions studied to date, some cite Constantinople as the place of provenance. Inside one of the oldest buildings, some inscriptions similar to those discovered at the Lazzaretto Nuovo can be seen, and this inscription have yet to be restored. But we can mention that at least one is probably in Ottoman Turkish.
As you have said, the Lazzaretto has witnessed the arrival in Venice of goods, but also merchants and travelers from the Near East. What happened to those travelers of Muslim faith who died in Venice because of the plague or for other reasons?
Well, thanks for this question. It's very interesting indeed. Well, the management of health during epidemics imposed rapid burials for the numerous victims. At the Lazzaretto Nuovo, the Christian cemetery, called Camposanto, was flanked by another burial area called Cimitero de Tripolini, whose name derives from Tripoli, which is Tarablus. This area was reserved for Muslims, and it's indicative of a numerically significant presence among the people who passed through the quarantine island.
Thank you, Lara, for being with us today for our fourth episode of A History of Epidemics in the Near and Middle East. We would like also to thank the Archeo Club of Venice and Ecos Club for their help in the preparation of this podcast. For our listener, you can find all references to this interview on the site of the IFPO, www.ifporient.org. next episode, the IFPO will host Silvia Scifolo, who will discuss with us about the history of health policies in Mecca.